The fluorescent lights of the hallway always seemed to hum a little louder when Kevin was scrubbing the floors. It was like the building itself was mocking the rhythm of his push broom. He kept his head down, shoulders hunched under a faded jumpsuit that smelled like industrial bleach and missed opportunities. Kevin was the invisible man of the campus, a working student who traded sleep for a paycheck and textbooks for a mop bucket. He was used to being the backdrop, the human scenery that people walked over without a second glance. But then there was Mike. Mike didn't just walk. He moved like the world was designed for his benefit. The captain of the soccer team. The kind of guy whose smile could probably fix a broken engine. Kevin would watch him from the shadows of the locker room door, heart doing a slow, painful thud against his ribs. It wasn't just that Mike was handsome. It was that he seemed to exist in a completely different dimension of light. One Tuesday evening, the air in the gym was thick with the scent of grass and sweat. Kevin was emptying the bins near the bench when the rest of the team started trailing in. They were high on a win, adrenaline turning their ego into something sharp and ugly. Xander, a midfielder with a permanent sneer, spotted Kevin. He kicked a discarded water bottle, sending a spray of backwash across Kevin's worn-out sneakers. The guy started laughing, that low, guttural sound that makes a person feel like they're shrinking. Xander stepped closer, looming over Kevin's thin frame, making comments about the dirt on his face and the grease in his hair. Kevin just gripped the handle of his broom until his knuckles turned white, staring at a crack in the linoleum, waiting for the storm to pass. Then, the laughter cut out like a severed wire. Mike stepped into the center of the circle, his shadow falling over Kevin like a shield. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. He just looked at Xander with a cold, quiet disappointment that was somehow worse than a punch. Mike told them to grow up. Told them that the only thing pathetic in the room was their behavior. He stayed there until the team dispersed, muttering under their breath. Kevin looked up, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. For a split second, their eyes met. Mike didn't give him a cheesy movie line or a pat on the back. He just nodded, a small, respectful acknowledgement of another human being, before turning to grab his gear. Weeks crawled by after that night. The dynamic didn't magically change into a friendship. There were no secret meetings in the library or sudden invites to parties. If anything, the distance felt even wider now that Mike had seen him at his lowest point. Kevin still scrubbed the floors, and Mike still scored the winning goals. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. Every time the team walked past the janitor's closet, Mike would linger for just a fraction of a second. He wasn't looking for a thank you, and Kevin was too terrified to offer one. They were two planets in the same galaxy, pulled together by a brief moment of gravity, but still light years apart. Kevin started noticing things. How Mike would leave his locker slightly ajar, or how he stayed late to practice long after the others had gone to the showers. One rainy Friday, when the campus was nearly deserted, Kevin was polishing the trophies in the main lobby, the gold reflecting the exhaustion in his eyes. He heard the heavy thud of the double doors, and then the sound of wet cleats on stone. Mike was standing there, soaked to the bone, holding a soccer ball under his arm. He looked tired, truly tired, for the first time since Kevin had known him. He stopped at the display case. Kevin worked the cloth over the glass. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unsaid, until Mike finally spoke, his voice low and raspy from the cold air. Mike shifted his weight, the water from his jersey dripping onto the freshly waxed floor with a steady, rhythmic tap. Kevin didn't look up immediately, his hand shaking just enough to make the microfiber cloth snag on the corner of a brass plaque. He felt the heat rising in his neck, that familiar, burning shame of being caught in his own smallness. But Mike wasn't moving. He wasn't walking away toward the locker rooms like he usually did. The silence in the lobby was thick, heavy with the smell of rain and floor wax. Finally, Kevin cleared his throat, the sound rasping in the quiet air. He told Mike he shouldn't be standing there in the wet clothes, that he'd catch a cold before the playoffs. It was a stupid thing to say, a janitor giving advice to the golden boy, but the words just tumbled out. Mike let out a short, dry laugh that didn't sound like his usual confident self. He leaned against the trophy case, his shoulder inches away from Kevin's arm. He looked at the row of gold statues, his eyes tracking the names of the legends who had come before him. He told Kevin that sometimes the weight of everyone's expectations felt a lot heavier than the gear he carried. Kevin stopped scrubbing. He looked at Mike's profile, the way the overhead lights caught the moisture on his skin. For the first time, he didn't see a popular athlete. He saw a kid who was exhausted by his own life. Kevin didn't know how to comfort someone like Mike, someone who had everything. So he just stayed there, a silent witness to a crack in the armor. Mike turned his head then, his gaze landing on the textbook peeking out of Kevin's jumpsuit pocket. It was an advanced physics manual. The spine creased and the pages dog-eared. Mike's eyebrows pulled together in a look of genuine curiosity. He asked if that was what Kevin did when he wasn't cleaning up after people who didn't deserve his time. Kevin felt a pulse of electricity go through him. It wasn't a joke. There was no punchline coming. Mike was actually looking at him, seeing the brain behind the broom. Kevin admitted that he wanted to be an engineer, that the school was just a means to an end, a way to build something that would last longer than a clean floor. The conversation didn't turn into a deep confession. It stayed on the surface. Safe, but different. Mike talked about the pressure to stay perfect, and Kevin talked about the peace he found in the quiet hours of the night shift. They were two people living in the same building, finally acknowledging that they were breathing the same air, but that the heavy doors at the end of the hall swung open. The sound of raucous laughter and the heavy footsteps of the rest of the team echoed through the corridor. Xander and the others were coming back from a late dinner, their voices booming off the walls. Mike's posture changed instantly. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by that mask of cool indifference. He didn't move away, but he straightened up, his eyes darting toward the entrance. Kevin felt the shift like a cold breeze. He knew how this worked. He knew that a guy like Mike couldn't be seen having a heart-to-heart with the nerd in the jumpsuit. Kevin went back to his polishing, his movements mechanical and fast. He told Mike he should go before the guys saw him. Mike looked like he wanted to say something else, his mouth opening slightly, but the footsteps were getting closer. He gripped his soccer ball tighter, gave Kevin one last unreadable look, and disappeared into the shadows of the back hallway just as the team rounded the corner. The next morning, the sun was cutting through the high windows of the gym, casting long, sharp shadows across the bleachers. Kevin was finishing his round, the smell of floor wax still clinging to his skin like a second layer of clothing. He'd left his physics manual on the bottom shelf of a supply cart. A mistake he realized the second he saw Xander and the rest of the varsity lineup swaggering toward the locker rooms. Xander stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes locking onto the thick, worn-out book. He picked it up with 2 fingers, like he was holding something radioactive. He started reading the complex equations out loud, his voice dripping with a mock, high-pitched tone that made the guys behind him howl with laughter. He called out Kevin's name, his voice echoing off the rafters, asking if the janitor was planning on building a rocket ship out of mop buckets. Kevin stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wanted to grab the book and run, but his legs felt like lead. He could see Mike at the back of the group, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Mike wasn't laughing, but he wasn't stopping them either. He was looking at the floor, his jaw tight, his eyes shielded by the brim of his cap. Xander stepped closer to Kevin, the book held high above his head. He teased him about being a genius in a jumpsuit. A working student who thought he was better than the people who actually belonged there. He made a move to toss the manual into a nearby trash bin, his grin widening as he waited for Kevin to beg. The air in the gym felt thin, suffocating. Kevin looked at Mike, silently pleading for the same shield he'd been given weeks ago. But Mike stayed silent. He was the captain, the leader, and the social cost of defending the nerd twice in 1 month was starting to show on his face. Just as Xander's arm started to swing, Mike finally moved. He didn't snatch the book. He didn't even raise his voice. He just walked over and plucked the manual out of Xander's hand with a casual, effortless motion. He flipped through the pages for a second, then handed it back to Kevin without a word. Xander's face went red. The embarrassment of being shut down by his own captain stoking a fire in his eyes. He muttered something about Mike being soft, about how he was spending too much time hanging out with the help. The rest of the team shifted uncomfortably, the tension between their two best players vibrating in the air. Mike didn't look back at them. He just told everyone to get to the field for drills, that they had a game to win, and not enough talent to waste time on the sidelines. The group followed him, but the silence they left behind was different this time. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of a brewing storm. Kevin gripped his book, the edges of the cover slightly bent where Xander had held it. He watched Mike lead the team out to the grass, his stride steady, but his shoulders stiff. They still weren't friends. They hadn't even shared a real greeting in front of others. But the divide was narrowing in a way that felt dangerous. Later that evening, the rain returned, a slow, steady drizzle that turned the campus gray. Kevin was in the library basement, the only place he could find peace to study. He heard the door creak open, a sound that shouldn't have happened this late. He looked up to see Mike standing there. No soccer ball, no teammates, just a guy looking for a place to hide from the noise of his own life. The next morning, the sun was cutting through the high windows of the gym, casting long, sharp shadows across the bleachers. Kevin was finishing his rounds, the smell of floor wax still clinging to his skin like a second layer of clothing. He'd left his physics manual on the bottom shelf of a supply cart. A mistake he realized the second he saw Xander and the rest of the varsity line up swaggering toward the locker rooms. Xander stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes locking onto the thick, worn-out book. He picked it up with 2 fingers, like he was holding something radioactive. He started reading the complex equations out loud, his voice dripping with a mock, high-pitched tone that made the guys behind him howl with laughter. He called out Kevin's name, his voice echoing off the rafters, asking if the janitor was planning on building a rocket ship out of mop buckets. Kevin stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wanted to grab the book and run, but his legs felt like lead. He could see Mike at the back of the group, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Mike wasn't laughing, but he wasn't stopping them either. He was looking at the floor, his jaw tight, his eyes shielded by the brim of his cap. Xander stepped closer to Kevin, the book held high above his head. He teased him about being a genius in a jumpsuit, a working student who thought he was better than the people who actually belonged there. He made a move to toss the manual into a nearby trash bin, his grin widening as he waited for Kevin to beg. The air in the gym felt thin, suffocating. Kevin looked at Mike, silently pleading for the same shield he'd been given weeks ago. But Mike stayed silent. He was the captain, the leader, and the social cost of defending the nerd twice in 1 month was starting to show on his face. Just as Xander's arm started to swing, Mike finally moved. He didn't snatch the book. He didn't even raise his voice. He just walked over and plucked the manual out of Xander's hand with a casual, effortless motion. He flipped through the pages for a second, then handed it back to Kevin without a word. Xander's face went red. the embarrassment of being shut down by his own captain stoking a fire in his eyes. He muttered something about Mike being soft, about how he was spending too much time hanging out with the help. The rest of the team shifted uncomfortably, the tension between their two best players vibrating in the air. Mike didn't look back at them. He just told everyone to get to the field for drills, that they had a game to win, and not enough talent to waste time on the sidelines. The group followed him, but the silence they left behind was different this time. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of a brewing storm. Kevin gripped his book, the edges of the cover slightly bent where Xander had held it. He watched Mike lead the team out to the grass, his stride steady, but his shoulders stiff. They still weren't friends. They hadn't even shared a real greeting in front of others. But the divide was narrowing in a way that felt dangerous. Later that evening, the rain returned, a slow, steady drizzle that turned the campus gray. Kevin was in the library basement, the only place he could find peace to study. He heard the door creak open, a sound that shouldn't have happened this late. He looked up to see Mike standing there. No soccer ball, no teammates, just a guy looking for a place to hide from the noise of his own life. The basement of the library always smelled like damp paper and forgotten secrets. The kind of place where the air felt heavy enough to drown out the rest of the world. Kevin didn't move, his pen hovering over a complex derivation of kinetic energy. He watched Mike pull a chair out, the screech of wood against the concrete floor sounding like a gunshot in the silence. Mike didn't ask for permission. He just sat down across from the scarred wooden table, dropping a heavy backpack that looked far too full for a guy who supposedly had everything handed to him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the hum of the old boiler in the corner, and the rhythmic scratching of Kevin's pen as he tried to pretend his heart wasn't trying to kick its way out of his chest. Mike reached into his bag and pulled out a notebook. But he didn't open it. He just stared at the equations on Kevin's page, his brow furrowing as if he were trying to decode a foreign language. Finally, Mike broke the silence, his voice a low vibration that seemed to fill the small room. He admitted that he was failing his calculus midterm, that if his GPA dropped another point, the scouts wouldn't care how many goals he scored. It was a confession that felt like a surrender, a king admitting his crown was made of lead. He looked at Kevin, not with pity or a sense of superiority, but with a raw, desperate kind of honesty. Kevin looked down at his own notes, then back at the golden boy sitting in the dim light of a flickering fluorescent bulb. He could have walked away, could have let the captain of the soccer team crash and burn after the way his friends had treated him. But there was something in Mike's eyes, a flicker of the same exhaustion Kevin felt every single night when he picked up that mop. Without saying a word, Kevin slid his textbook toward the center of the table. He started explaining the first derivative, his voice steady and calm, stripping away the jargon until the math started to make sense. He didn't make Mike feel small for not knowing it, and Mike didn't make Kevin feel invisible for being the one to teach him. Hours bled into each other, the rain outside turning into a rhythmic drumming against the high, narrow windows. They worked in a bubble of focused energy. Two people who inhabited completely different social tiers, suddenly finding a common language in numbers and variables. Mike was a fast learner when he wasn't trying to maintain an image, and Kevin found that teaching someone else made his own understanding feel sharper, more permanent. At one point, Mike stopped mid-sentence, his gaze drifting to the calluses on Kevin's hands. He asked how Kevin did it, how he balanced the double shifts in the labs and the constant noise of a campus that treated him like a ghost. Kevin just shrugged, saying that when you don't have a safety net, you learn how to climb pretty fast. The moment stretched, becoming something more than just a tutoring session. Mike reached out, his hand hovering near Kevin's on the table. A silent bridge that neither of them was quite brave enough to cross yet. The tension was different now. It wasn't the sharp edge of a locker room confrontation. It was the soft, terrifying pull of genuine connection. But the real world was waiting just upstairs. The sound of a security guard's keys jingling in the hallway above signaled that the building was closing. Mike packed his bags quickly. His movements efficient and practiced. He stood up, pausing at the door of the basement. He told Kevin that he couldn't tell the guys about this, that the team wouldn't understand. Kevin nodded, the familiar sting of reality settling back into his bones. He knew the rules. He knew that in the daylight, they were still the athlete and the janitor. But as Mike turned to leave, he stopped and looked back one more time. His voice barely a whisper. He told Kevin that he'd see him tomorrow night. Same time, same place. The next few nights became a blur of whispered equations and the low hum of the library basement. Mike would show up exactly 10 minutes after the final team meeting, his hood pulled low, looking less like a captain and more like a man escaping a cage. Kevin would already be there, his textbooks spread out over the scarred wood. A small island of order in a world that demanded he be nothing more than a shadow with a spray bottle. They developed a rhythm that didn't require much small talk. Kevin would point out a flaw in a logic chain, and Mike would nod, his fingers tracing the lines of Kevin's handwriting. Sometimes their hands would brush over a shared diagram, and the air in the cramped room would feel suddenly dangerously thin. Mike didn't pull away as fast as he used to. He stayed in the heat of the moment, his eyes lingering on Kevin's face in a way that made Kevin's pulse skip a beat. But Xander wasn't stupid. He'd noticed Mike's sudden disappearing acts, the way he'd stopped checking his phone during team dinners, and the strange, quiet confidence he was carrying into his morning classes. Xander started watching the exits, his suspicion turning into a sharp, jagged curiosity. He didn't like being left out, and he liked Mike having secrets even less. On a Thursday night, and the tension finally snapped, Kevin was explaining a complex physics problem, his voice soft and focused. When the basement door didn't just creak, it slammed open. The sound echoed off the concrete walls like a gunshot. Xander stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh light of the hall. Behind him, two other teammates peered in, their faces twisted into identical expressions of confusion and mockery. Xander walked into the room, his boots heavy on the floor, his eyes scanning the table where the golden boy was sitting shoulder to shoulder with the campus janitor. The sneer that crawled across Xander's face was slow and venomous. He didn't start with a shout. He started with a laugh, a cold, hollow sound that made Kevin feel like the walls were closing in. He asked Mike if this was his big secret, if he'd traded his social standing for a seat at the nerd table. He looked at Kevin like he was something Mike had scraped off the bottom of his shoe, making comments about how the cleaning crew was finally moving up in the world. Mike stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. His face was a mask of stone, but Kevin could see the slight tremor in his hands. The social hierarchy of the school was a fragile thing, and it was shattering right in front of them. Xander stepped closer, grabbing one of Kevin's notebooks and flipping through it with a theatrical sigh. He started reading Kevin's personal notes out loud, mocking the neat, precise handwriting, the dreams of engineering, the small, private thoughts Kevin had scribbled in the margins. Kevin felt the familiar burn of humiliation, that old, deep-seated urge to vanish into the floorboards. He reached for the book, but Xander held it high, laughing as he backed away. He told Mike that the whole team was going to love this, that the captain was being tutored by a guy who smelled like bleach. The silence that followed was suffocating. Kevin looked at Mike, waiting for the defense, waiting for the shield. But Mike was looking at Xander, his eyes darting between his teammate and the door. The pressure of his reputation, the weight of the scholarship, the fear of being an outcast in his own world, it was all written in the tension of his jaw. Xander tossed the notebook toward the trash bin in the corner, a casual, cruel gesture meant to end the night. He told Mike it was time to go, that they had a real party to get to, and that the help could finish cleaning up the mess. Mike didn't move for a long second. He looked at the notebook on the floor, then at Kevin, whose glasses were fogging up from the heat of his own shame. The teammates at the door were waiting, their presence a silent demand for Mike to choose a side. The air in the basement felt like it was ionizing, thick with the metallic tang of an impending storm. Mike's chest rose and fell in a shallow, jagged rhythm. He looked at Xander, then at the teammates standing like sentinels in the doorway, and finally at Kevin, who was currently trying to shrink into the shadows of the utility pipes. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was a physical weight, pressing down on the golden boy's shoulders until something inside him finally snapped. Mike didn't walk toward the door. He didn't even look at Xander. Instead, he stepped toward the trash bin. The clatter of his cleats on the concrete was the only sound as he reached down and retrieved Kevin's notebook. His fingers brushing off a smudge of dust from the cover with a deliberate, slow tenderness. He turned back to the group, his face no longer a mask of stone, but something much sharper. He told Xander that the only thing trash in the room was the way they were acting. That being a captain didn't mean leading a pack of bullies. Xander's jaw dropped, the smug grin curdling into a look of pure, unfiltered shock. He started to stammer, to remind Mike of the hierarchy, of the scouts, of the party waiting for them at the frat house. But Mike just cut him off, his voice a low, dangerous growl that made even the guys at the door take a step back. He told them to leave, that he was busy actually learning something for once, and that if he heard a single word of this on the practice field, the season was going to get very, very lonely for all of them. The teammates scrambled, their bravado evaporating as they retreated into the hallway, the heavy door swinging shut with a final, echoing thud. The basement was quiet again, but the atmosphere had shifted into something unrecognizable. Mike didn't sit back down. He stood there, holding the notebook out to Kevin, his eyes dark with a mix of adrenaline and a terrifying kind of relief. Kevin took the book, his fingers trembling as they touched Mike's palm. He tried to thank him, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment, but Mike just shook his head, a small, sad smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He admitted that he should have done that a long time ago, that he was tired of pretending he didn't see what was happening right in front of him. They stood in the dim light, the athlete and the janitor, the popular boy and the invisible student. The barrier hadn't just been thinned, it had been demolished. Mike reached out, his hand settling on Kevin's shoulder, the heat of his skin seeping through the thin fabric of the jumpsuit. He didn't pull away this time. He stepped closer, the space between them disappearing until Kevin could smell the rain and the faint, clean scent of Mike's cologne. Outside, the storm was reaching its peak, thunder rolling across the campus like a warning. But in the basement, the world was small, and for the first time, it was theirs. Mike leaned in, his forehead resting against Kevin's, a silent, breathless question hanging in the air. He told Kevin that he didn't care about the scouts, or the team, or the noise upstairs. He just wanted to know if they could stay here, just for a little while longer, where the rules didn't apply. Kevin didn't answer with words. He just leaned back into the touch, his hand finding the edge of Mike's hoodie. They were still light years apart in the eyes of the world. But in the quiet of the library basement, the gravity was finally pulling them home. The morning after the basement felt different. The air on campus was charged with a static that Kevin could feel in the marrow of his bones. He was back in his jumpsuit, back to the rhythm of the mop and the bucket. But his skin felt like it was humming. He kept his head down as the soccer team filed past the main hallway, but he didn't miss the way Xander's sneer faltered when Mike didn't join in on the usual jabs. Mike walked at the front, his jaw set, eyes fixed forward, a king who had quietly abdicated his throne for something much more private. By the time the late afternoon practice ended, the sky had turned a bruised purple. Kevin was assigned to the athletic wing. The heavy scent of grass and expensive body wash hanging thick in the air. He waited until the lockers had cleared out, until the shouting and the snapping of towels had faded into the distance. The gym was a cathedral of echoes, and Kevin moved through it like a ghost, his boots squeaking on the tile. He pushed the door to the communal showers open, expecting the usual mess of discarded tape and empty Gatorade bottles. But the steam was already rising, thick, white veil that blurred the sharp edges of the room. Through the mist, he saw a silhouette standing under the furthest shower head. Mike didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed at the sound of the door. The water was drumming against the tile. Relentless, rhythmic heartbeat. Kevin stood frozen, his grip tightening on the handle of his mop. He should have turned back, should have left the mountain to his privacy. But his feet wouldn't move. Mike turned slowly, the water slicking his hair back, streaming down the hard, defined lines of his chest and over the ridge of his hip bones. He looked at Kevin, not with the distant cool of a teammate, but with a raw, heavy hunger that made the air in the room feel like it was boiling. He didn't say a word. He just reached out, his hand dripping, and beckoned Kevin forward into the steam. Kevin dropped the mop, the clatter echoing off the wet walls, and stepped into the heat. The humidity clung to his jumpsuit, making the fabric heavy and translucent against his skin. Mike stepped closer, his chest inches from Kevin's, the heat radiating off him in waves. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of Kevin's jaw, his touch searing, even through the spray of the water. He whispered that he couldn't stop thinking about the basement, about the way Kevin looked when he wasn't trying to hide. His voice was a low, gravelly vibration that settled deep in Kevin's chest. Mike's hands moved to the zipper of the jumpsuit, his movements slow, deliberate, giving Kevin every chance to pull away. But Kevin only leaned in, his breath hitching as the cool air of the room met the intense heat of Mike's body. The jumpsuit fell away, pooling at Kevin's feet in a sodden heap. For the first time, there were no books, no trophies, no social hierarchies to maintain. There was only the sound of the water and the frantic, desperate slide of skin against skin. Mike pulled him under the spray, the hot water drenching them both as he pressed Kevin back against the cool, tiled wall. Mike's mouth found Kevin's, the kiss tasting of salt and adrenaline. It wasn't the polished, perfect image of a star athlete. It was something primal. Release of all the tension they'd been building since that first night in the gym. Kevin's hands found purchase in Mike's hair, pulling him closer, needing to feel the weight of him, the reality of him. The world outside the shower curtain didn't exist anymore. There was no Xander, no scouts, no scholarship. There was only the steam, the rhythmic thud of the water, and the way Mike whispered Kevin's name against his neck like it was the only word he knew how to speak. They were tangled together, a chaotic, beautiful mess of limbs and breath, finding a rhythm that no textbook could ever explain. As the steam grew thicker, blurring the world into nothingness, Mike pulled back just enough to look Kevin in the eye. He told him that he wasn't going back, that he didn't want the life they'd picked out for him if it meant Kevin stayed in the shadows. The steam began to thin as the water temperature dropped, turning the air into a heavy, damp blanket that clung to their skin. Mike didn't pull away immediately, his forehead resting against Kevin's as their breathing slowed into a synchronized, ragged rhythm. He reached out and shut off the valve, the sudden silence in the locker room feeling louder than the roar of the shower ever was. Kevin felt the cold air hit his wet shoulders, a sharp reminder of the world waiting on the other side of the heavy metal doors. He started to reach for his discarded jumpsuit, the faded blue fabric a sodden heap on the tile. but Mike's hand caught his wrist. It wasn't a firm grip, just a lingering, silent request. Mike looked at him, really looked at him, his eyes scanning the sharp lines of Kevin's face without the fog of his glasses in the way. He told Kevin that the hiding was over, that he was done playing the part of the untouchable captain if it meant Kevin had to be a ghost. Kevin felt the surge of vertigo, a terrifying mix of hope and pure, unadulterated fear. He pointed out that Xander would be waiting, that the scouts would hear, that the scholarship he'd worked his entire life for was tied to an image that didn't include the school janitor. Mike just stepped into his own clothes, pulling on his varsity jacket with a deliberate, slow motion. He told Kevin that some things were worth the risk, and that a life lived in a locker room wasn't much of a life at all. They dressed in a heavy, charged silence. Every click of a locker and rustle of fabric felt like a countdown. When Kevin finally pushed his glasses back onto the bridge of his nose, the world snapped back into sharp, unforgiving focus. He picked up his mop, the wood handle feeling alien in his hands after the heat of the shower. Mike walked to the exit first, his hand hovering over the heavy steel handle. He looked back at Kevin, a silent question in his eyes. Kevin took a breath, straightened his shoulders under the damp jumpsuit, and nodded. The doors swung open with a groan. The fluorescent lights of the main hallway blindingly bright after the dim mist of the showers, and they were there. Xander was leaning against the trophy case, surrounded by a handful of the starting lineup. They hadn't gone to the party. They'd been waiting. Their faces twisted into a mix of boredom and predatory curiosity. Xander straightened up, a slow, toxic grin spreading across his face as he saw Mike walk out. He started to make a joke, something about the overtime Mike was putting in with the cleaning crew. But the words died in his throat when he saw the look on Mike's face, and more importantly, when he saw Mike reach back and catch Kevin's hand. The hallway went tomb quiet. The sound of a distant basketball game in the gym seemed to fade into nothingness. Xander's eyes dropped to their joined hands, his expression shifting from mockery to a cold, hard disbelief. He asked Mike if he was serious, if he was really going to throw away everything for a nerd in a jumpsuit. Mike didn't flinch. He didn't drop Kevin's hand. He stepped forward, pulling Kevin into the light with him. He told Xander that he'd never been more serious in his life, and that if anyone had a problem with it, they could take it up with him on the field tomorrow. The tension was a physical force, a wire pulled so tight it was vibrating. Kevin could feel the eyes of the elite staring at him, judging the grease on his shoes and the ink on his pens. But he also felt the warmth of Mike's palm against his, a solid, grounding weight that told him he wasn't standing alone anymore. They started walking, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the linoleum. Xander didn't move, his face a mask of fury as he watched the social order of the school crumble in real time. He shouted after them, a desperate, ugly threat about the scouts and the season. But Mike didn't even turn his head. They reached the double doors of the main entrance, the cool night air rushing in to meet them. Mike stopped under the glow of the street lamp, the rain finally having slowed to a soft, silver mist. He looked at Kevin, his thumb tracing circles over Kevin's knuckles. He told him that tomorrow was going to be the hardest day of their lives, that the whispers wouldn't stop for a long time. Kevin looked up at the darkened windows of the library, then back at the man who had traded a crown for a connection. He told Mike that he'd spent his whole life being invisible, so he wasn't afraid of people looking. Friday night arrived with the kind of electric tension that usually precedes a storm. But the clouds had cleared, leaving the stadium lights to cut through the darkness like surgical lasers. The air was thick with the smell of popcorn and cut grass, the bleachers packed with a sea of school colors. Kevin stood at the edge of the track, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jumpsuit. He was supposed to be emptying the bins near the concessions. but his eyes were fixed on the tunnel where the team would emerge. The rumors had traveled through the hallways like a virus for the last 48 hours. Every time Kevin pushed his broom past a group of students, the whispers would stop and the staring would begin. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, the janitor who had dared to touch the sun. Xander and the others had spent the pre-game warm-ups pointedly ignoring Mike, the locker room atmosphere turning into a cold, jagged silence that threatened to choke the season. Then, the drum line started. The crowd erupted as the team jogged onto the field. A blur of jerseys and adrenaline. Mike was at the lead, his stride long and powerful, but his face was set in a grim, focused line. He didn't look at the scouts in the front row or the cheering fans. He scanned the sidelines, his gaze cutting through the chaos until it landed squarely on Kevin. For a split second, the stadium disappeared. Mike didn't give a thumb up or a flashy wave. He just tapped his chest, right over his heart, small private signal that felt like a bolt of lightning hitting the dirt. The whistle blew, and the game was a brutal, physical grind. Xander was playing selfish, refusing to pass to Mike even when he had a clear shot at the goal. The tension on the field was palpable, the team's chemistry dissolving into a mess of ego and resentment. By the half, they were down by 2, and the crowd's cheers had turned into a confused, anxious murmur. In the locker room during the break, the explosion finally happened. Xander shoved Mike against a row of lockers, the metal clanging like a bell. He shouted about how Mike had ruined their focus, how his distraction was costing them the championship. He called Kevin a mistake, a smudge on the team's reputation that they'd never be able to scrub off. Mike didn't hit him. He didn't even push back. He just looked at Xander with a quiet, devastating pity. He told the team that if they were losing, it wasn't because of who he loved. It was because they were too busy looking at the sidelines to see the ball. He told them he was going back out there to win, and they could either follow their captain or stay in the dark. The second half was a different story. Mike played like a man possessed, his movements a masterclass in precision and speed. He stopped waiting for Xander's passes and started creating his own opportunities, carving through the defense like they were made of paper. He scored once, then twice, the momentum shifting so fast the crowd was screaming themselves hoarse. With 30 seconds left on the clock, the score was tied. Mike had the ball at midfield, the sweat stinging his eyes. He saw the opening, saw the way the scouts were leaning forward in their seats. But he also saw Kevin standing near the goalpost, holding his breath. Mike took the shot. The ball arched through the night air, a perfect, silver curve that hit the back of the net with a satisfying snap. The stadium went nuclear. The buzzer sounded, and the team swarmed the field. Xander stood alone near the bench, his face a mask of bitter defeat. Mike broke through the crowd of teammates and fans, ignoring the cameras and the cheering students. He ran straight for the sideline, straight for the guy in the faded jumpsuit. He didn't care about the sweat or the dirt or the eyes of the entire town. He grabbed Kevin by the front of his jumpsuit and pulled him into a kiss that silenced the front 3 rows of the bleachers. It wasn't a secret anymore. It wasn't a basement confession or a shower room whisper. It was the truth, written in the bright lights of a Friday night. The roar of the crowd was a muffled thud in the background, like a heartbeat that belonged to someone else. Mike didn't let go of Kevin's jumpsuit, his fingers still tangled in the cheap, blue fabric as the cameras flashed like tiny, jagged lightning bolts. He could feel the eyes of the scouts in the front row, the men in the dark suits with their clipboards and their power to decide a person's future. They weren't looking at the scoreboard anymore. They were looking at the captain of the soccer team holding the school janitor like his life depended on it. Mike pulled back just enough to see Kevin's face, the way his glasses were crooked and his eyes were wide with a mix of terror and a new, burning pride. He wiped a smudge of turf from Kevin's cheek his thumb lingering on his skin. He whispered that it didn't matter what they said now, that the game was won and the truth was out. But then, the circle of fans and teammates parted. Two men in charcoal gray blazers stepped onto the grass, their expressions unreadable. One of them was holding a folder with the university crest, the kind of folder that contained a full-ride scholarship and a ticket out of this town. They looked at Mike, then at Kevin, then back at the scoreboard. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise of the stadium. Xander was watching from the bench, a bitter, expectant smirk on his face. He was waiting for the fall, waiting for the moment the scouts turned their backs and took the future with them. He'd spent the whole season believing that perfection was a requirement for success, and he was sure Mike had just broken the contract. The lead scout, a man with graying hair and eyes that had seen 1,000 players come and go, stepped forward. He didn't look at the jumpsuit. He didn't look at the grease on Kevin's hands. He looked Mike straight in the eye and told him that he'd never seen a player carry a team through that kind of internal collapse before. He said that talent was easy to find, but character was what won championships. He handed Mike the folder. The scout glanced at Kevin, a small, respectful nod that felt like a bridge being built over a canyon. He told Mike to bring his tutor to the campus visit next month, because a player who knew how to balance that much pressure was exactly what their engineering department was looking for too. The smirk on Xander's face vanished, replaced by a hollow, empty stare. The world hadn't ended. The social hierarchy hadn't just shifted. It had been rewritten by someone who wasn't afraid to be seen in the light. Mike let out a breath he'd been holding since the basement, a long, shaky exhale that turned into a laugh. He grabbed Kevin's hand, their fingers locking together as they started to walk off the field. They passed the lockers, past the showers where the steam had once hidden them, and headed toward the parking lot. The rain started again, a soft, cool drizzle that felt like a baptism. Mike stopped at his car, a beat-up silver sedan that looked nothing like a star athlete's ride in the moonlight. He leaned against the door, pulling Kevin into his space, the heat of the game still radiating off his skin. He told Kevin that the scouts were right, that he wasn't going anywhere without the person who taught him how to see the world for what it really was. Kevin reached up, his fingers tracing the C on Mike's jersey. He told him that he was still a working student, that he still had floors to scrub and labs to finish. Mike just smiled, that slow, devastating smile that made Kevin's heart feel like it was finally in the right place. He told Kevin that they'd scrub the floors together if they had to, as long as they were standing on the same side of the door. They sat in the car for a long time, watching the stadium lights flicker and die out one by one. The campus was quiet again, but it wasn't the silence of a secret. It was the silence of a beginning. Mike reached over and clicked on the radio, a low, slow melody filling the small space between them. He leaned over and kissed the bridge of Kevin's nose, right where his glasses always slipped. The future was still a long, winding road, full of exams and practices and people who would always have something to say. But as the engine hummed to life and they pulled out of the lot, Kevin didn't feel invisible anymore. He felt like the only person in the world who truly mattered. The transition to the university campus felt like stepping into a different timeline, one where the air was thinner and the possibilities were as vast as the glass and steel architecture of the engineering wing. Kevin stood at the base of the massive library steps, his worn-out backpack feeling lighter than it ever had back home. He wasn't wearing a jumpsuit. For the first time in years, he was wearing a clean, dark sweater and jeans that didn't smell like industrial pine cleaner. The scholarship had covered the tuition, but it hadn't erased the habit of looking over his shoulder. Kevin still felt the phantom weight of a mop in his hand every time he saw a spill on the linoleum. He started to move toward his first advanced mechanics lecture, his head down, falling back into the old rhythm of being a ghost in a crowded room. Then, a heavy arm draped over his shoulder, pulling him back into the heat of the present. Mike was there, looking like a natural part of the scenery in his new university varsity jacket. He hadn't changed. Not really. He still had that lopsided smile that made the girls in the quad stop and stare, and he still moved with the easy confidence of a man who knew exactly where he was going. But the way he looked at Kevin was different now. It was open, steady, and completely unapologetic. He didn't care that the scouts were watching from the athletic office windows or that the new teammates were sizing him up. He pulled Kevin close, his fingers hooked into the strap of Kevin's bag, and started talking about the physics problem they'd been arguing over at breakfast. They walked through the center of the campus, two people who had survived the storm of their own reputations and come out on the other side. The athletic wing and the engineering labs were on opposite ends of the park, a physical divide that mirrored the social one they'd broken. Mike stopped at the fork in the path, the sun catching the gold in his eyes. He told Kevin that he'd meet him at the fountain after his morning drills, that he wasn't going to let a 3-hour practice be the longest they went without seeing each other. Kevin watched him walk away, his heart doing that familiar, slow thud. He turned toward the lecture hall, but he didn't slouch. He walked in with his chin up, taking a seat in the front row instead of the shadows at the back. The lecture was a blur of high-level calculus and structural theory, the kind of stuff that made Kevin's brain feel like it was finally firing on all cylinders. He was scribbling notes, his pen moving with a frantic, joyous energy when he felt a vibration in his pocket. He pulled out his phone to see a text from Mike, a photo of a messy locker and a caption that said he'd already forgotten how to solve for X without his tutor. Kevin smiled, a real private smile that didn't have any fear behind it. By the time the afternoon sun was hitting the fountain, the campus was buzzing with the energy of a Friday. Kevin was waiting on the stone ledge, his nose buried in a blueprint, when he heard the familiar, rhythmic sound of cleats on pavement. Mike was jogging toward him, dripping with sweat and smelling like the grass of the practice field. He didn't stop at the edge of the fountain. He stepped right into Kevin's space, blocking out the sun and the rest of the world. He told Kevin that the coach was already breathing down his neck about his footwork, but that he had told the man he had a much more important meeting to attend. They sat there for a long time, watching the water dance in the light. People walked by, some staring, some nodding, but none of it felt like a threat anymore. They were just two students, one with a ball and one with a book, finally living the life they'd fought for in the basement of a high school library. Mike reached over and closed Kevin's textbook, his hand covering the page. He whispered that the studying could wait, that the night was too clear to spend it looking at paper. He pulled Kevin to his feet, his grip firm and warm, and led him toward the parking lot where the silver sedan was waiting. The future was still a long road. But as they drove away from the campus and toward the quiet of the hills, Kevin knew that the invisibility was gone for good. He wasn't the janitor, and Mike wasn't just the captain. They were just Mike and Kevin, and for the first time, that was more than enough. The drive out of the city felt like shedding a heavy skin, the concrete and the glass of the university fading into a blur of deep greens and the golden hue of the late afternoon sun. Mike's hand was a steady, grounding weight on Kevin's knee, his fingers tapping along to the rhythm of a low, bluesy track on the radio. They were headed toward a small cabin near the lake, a place where the air didn't smell like textbooks or locker room sweat. Kevin leaned his head against the cool glass of the window, watching the shadows of the trees dance across the dashboard. He still felt a lingering, phantom anxiety, a muscle memory of looking over his shoulder for Xander or a disapproving coach. But every time he glanced at Mike's profile, the way the sunlight caught the sharp line of his jaw and the relaxed, easy curve of his mouth, the tension in Kevin's chest loosened just a little more. They reached the cabin as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges. It was a small, weathered place, isolated and quiet. Mike didn't wait to unpack. He grabbed Kevin's hand the second the engine cut out, leading him down the narrow, dirt path toward the water's edge. The lake was a sheet of dark glass, reflecting the first few stars that were starting to blink into existence. Mike stopped at the end of the small wooden pier, the planks creaking under their weight. He pulled Kevin into his space, his arms wrapping around Kevin's waist, pulling him flush against his chest. The heat of him was a physical force, a constant, reliable anchor. Mike whispered that he'd spent so long being watched by thousands of people that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be completely alone with the only person who actually mattered. He reached up, his fingers sliding under the frames of Kevin's glasses to brush against his cheek. He told Kevin that he didn't want to talk about the scholarship, or the next game, or the engineering finals. He just wanted to listen to the sound of the water and the way Kevin's heart was beating against his own. The night air was turning sharp and cold, but the heat between them was rising. Mike leaned down, his mouth finding the sensitive skin of Kevin's neck, his breath a warm, ragged vibration. Kevin's hands found purchase in the soft fabric of Mike's hoodie, pulling him closer, needing to feel the reality of this moment without the filters of the campus life. They moved back toward the cabin, the porch light a small, amber beacon in the darkness. Inside, the air was still and smelled of cedar and old wood. Mike didn't turn on the overhead lights. He led Kevin toward the fireplace, the only sound the crackle of the dry logs as the flames began to take hold. In the flickering orange light, the world felt small and safe. Mike started to pull his hoodie over his head, his muscles rippling under the firelight. A masterpiece of grit and grace. He looked at Kevin, his eyes dark with a hunger that wasn't about a game or a social status. It was the same look he'd given him in the basement. Only now, there was no door for anyone to burst through. Kevin stepped forward, his fingers trembling only slightly as he reached for the buttons of his own shirt. He told Mike that he'd spent his whole life trying to be invisible, but that being seen by him was the only thing that made him feel real. Mike didn't answer with words. He just reached out and pulled Kevin into a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and a long overdue freedom. They sank onto the rug in front of the fire, the heat of the flames matching the fire in their blood. The hierarchy of the world, the expectations of the team, the pressure of the labs. It all burned away in the quiet of the cabin. The morning sun filtered through the high canopy of the pine trees, casting long, serrated shadows across the wooden floor of the cabin. Kevin woke up to the sound of a blue jay scolding the wind and the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the man beside him. Mike was still fast asleep, one arm thrown over his head and the other anchored firmly across Kevin's waist. His skin radiating a natural, furnace-like heat that had kept the chill of the mountain air at bay all night. Kevin stayed still for a long time, watching the light catch the gold stubble on Mike's jaw. It was a strange, beautiful thing to see the captain of the varsity team looking so completely undone, stripped of the jersey and the expectations. In the quiet of the woods, there was no crowd to cheer for him and no teammates to judge him. There was just a guy who had chosen a janitor's heart over a stadium's roar. Slowly, Kevin untangled himself from the sheets, his bare feet silent on the cool cedar planks. He found his glasses on the bedside table and stepped out onto the porch, the air sharp and smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. The lake was a mirror of silver mist. The surface so still it looked like it hadn't been touched in 1,000 years. He leaned against the railing, the cold biting into his shoulders. He thought about the mop bucket and the industrial bleach, the way his life used to be measured in the number of tiles he could scrub before the sun came up. It felt like a lifetime ago. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a man who belonged to someone. The screen door creaked behind him, and then he felt a heavy, fleece-lined blanket being draped over his shoulders. Mike pulled him back against his chest, his chin resting on the top of Kevin's head. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through Kevin's spine as he asked if Kevin was trying to freeze himself before breakfast. Kevin leaned back into the warmth, his hands covering Mike's over his chest. He told Mike that he was just making sure the world was still there, that it wasn't all some elaborate dream he'd had in the basement of the high school library. Mike let out a soft, dry laugh, his breath hot against the back of Kevin's neck. He told Kevin that if it was a dream, he wasn't planning on waking up anytime soon. He steered Kevin back inside, where the embers of the fire were still glowing a deep, pulsing red. They moved through the kitchen with a quiet, domestic ease, Mike fumbling with the coffee percolator while Kevin started on the eggs. It was a mundane, simple scene, but after a year of hiding in shadows and locker rooms, it felt like a revolution. There were no scouts watching them, no Xander waiting to strike, just two people trying to figure out how to be a we instead of a secret. Mike sat at the small wooden table, his eyes fixed on Kevin as he moved. He admitted that he'd already received a call from the athletic director, a reminder about the mandatory team dinner on Monday. He looked at Kevin, the question hanging in the air, unspoken but heavy. Kevin stopped at the stove, the spatula hovering over the pan. He knew what Mike was asking. He was asking if they were going to do this for real, if Kevin was ready to walk into a room full of people who still saw him as the help, and Mike as the king. He turned around, his gaze steady behind his glasses. He told Mike that he'd spent his whole life being the person who cleaned up the mess, so he wasn't afraid of a little dirt. If Mike was brave enough to hold his hand in front of the cameras, Kevin was brave enough to stand by his side at a dinner table. Mike's smile was slow, deep, and full of the kind of relief that only comes when you realize you don't have to carry the weight alone. He stood up, crossing the small kitchen in 2 strides to pull Kevin into a kiss that tasted of coffee and the promise of a future they were building from the ground up. Monday night arrived with a sky the color of a fresh bruise, heavy and thick with the scent of an approaching storm. The university banquet hall was a cavern of polished marble and crystal chandeliers, a space designed to make the athletic elite feel like gods. Kevin stood in front of the full-length mirror in their small apartment, tugging at the collar of a charcoal suit that Mike had insisted on buying him. He felt like a fraud in the expensive fabric, his hands still bearing the faint, stubborn calluses of a man who knew the weight of a mop bucket better than the feel of silk. Mike stepped into the frame behind him, his own tuxedo jacket broad across his shoulders. He didn't say a word, just reached out and straightened Kevin's tie with a slow, deliberate precision. He met Kevin's eyes in the glass, his gaze steady and full of a quiet, fierce pride. He told Kevin that they weren't going in there to seek permission. They were going in to claim a seat that was already theirs. The drive to the hall was silent. The hum of the engine, the only heartbeat in the small space of the car. When they pulled up to the valet, the flashbulbs started almost instantly. The local sports press was there, hungry for a follow-up on the captain who had broken the social contract of the season. Mike didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the car, walked around to the passenger side, and opened the door for Kevin. He reached out his hand, and Kevin took it, their fingers locking together in front of the cameras and the whispering donors. The walk into the hall felt like a descent into a lion's den. The air was thick with the clink of silverware and the low, judgmental murmur of the alumni. At the head table, Xander was already seated, his face a mask of cold, aristocratic boredom. He looked at Kevin's suit, then at Mike's hand, his lip curling into a sneer that didn't quite hide the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. They took their seats at the center table, right under the main chandelier. The athletic director stood up to give a speech about tradition and excellence, his voice booming off the walls. He talked about the history of the program, about the kind of men who built the university's reputation. It was a pointed, sharp reminder of the box they were expected to fit into. But Mike wasn't listening. under the white linen tablecloth. His hand was anchored on Kevin's thigh, his thumb tracing slow, rhythmic circles over the fabric. The heat of him was a silent, defiant pulse in the middle of the cold room. When the dinner was served, the whispers grew louder. A donor at the next table made a comment about the diversity of the student body, his voice just loud enough for Kevin to hear. Kevin felt the familiar, burning shame start to creep up his neck, that old urge to vanish into the floorboards and start scrubbing until the world was clean again. Mike's grip tightened on his leg. He didn't look at the donor. He didn't make a scene. He just leaned in close to Kevin, his breath hot against his ear. He told Kevin that the only people who mattered in the room were the two of them, and that he'd rather be at a table for two in a library basement than in a hall full of ghosts. The tension broke when the dessert was cleared. Xander stood up, his chair screeching against the marble. He raised a glass, his eyes fixed on Mike. He offered a toast to the captain, his voice dripping with a mock, sugary sincerity. He asked if Mike was going to bring his assistant to the national championships, or if the janitors' union was going to provide the pom-poms. The room went dead quiet. Even the server stopped moving. Mike stood up, his movements slow and graceful, like a predator finding its footing. He didn't raise his glass. He just looked at Xander, his silence more devastating than a shout. He told the room that Kevin wasn't his assistant. He was the reason Mike was still standing on that field. He said that if the university wanted a captain who cared more about a suit than a soul, they'd picked the wrong man. He turned to Kevin, reaching out his hand in front of the board of directors and the scouts and the bitter teammates. He told Kevin it was time to go, that the air in the room was getting too thin to breathe. They walked out of the banquet hall, leaving the trophies and the traditions behind them. The rain was finally falling, a heavy, cleansing downpour that washed the city lights into a blur of neon and gray. They reached the car, but Mike didn't open the door. He pushed Kevin back against the cool, wet metal, his mouth finding Kevin's in a kiss that tasted of rain and a final, beautiful victory. The tuxedo was soaked, the charcoal fabric clinging to Kevin's skin, but he'd never felt more visible. They were two planets that had finally broken out of their orbits, spinning into a dark, unknown space where they could finally make their own rules. The rain was drumming against the roof of the silver sedan like 1,000 tiny applause tracks as they pulled into the gravel lot of their apartment complex. The heavy, stifling air of the banquet hall was a lifetime away, replaced by the scent of wet asphalt and the ozone of the storm. Mike didn't move to get out immediately. He sat in the driver's seat, his hands still gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles were white. The adrenaline of the confrontation slowly ebbing into a deep, jagged exhaustion. Kevin reached over him, his fingers uncurling Mike's grip one by one. He didn't say a word, just pressed his palm against Mike's, the heat of their skin a silent, grounding anchor in the dark cabin of the car. Mike let out a long, shaky breath, his head dropping back against the headrest. He looked at Kevin, his tuxedo tie hanging loose around his neck, and a small, lopsided smile finally broke through the tension. He told Kevin that he'd never seen a man look better in charcoal, even if the suit was currently a sodden mess. They ran through the downpour to the front door, laughing like kids who had just pulled off the biggest heist in the city's history. Inside the small, dimly lit apartment, the air was quiet and smelled of old books and the faint, clean scent of the laundry Kevin had folded that morning. The contrast was jarring. The marble floors of the university replaced by a worn-out rug and a kitchen table that had seen better days. Mike didn't wait to turn on the lights. He pulled Kevin into the center of the room, his hands sliding under the damp fabric of Kevin's suit jacket to find the heat of his waist. He whispered that he didn't care about the board of directors, or the scouts, or the look on Xander's face. He just wanted to be back in the space where they didn't have to be anything but themselves. The wet clothes hit the floor in a heavy, rhythmic thud, the charcoal suit and the silk tie discarded like the expectations they represented. Mike's skin was cool from the rain, but his touch was searing. He pushed Kevin back against the door, his mouth finding the pulse point at Kevin's throat. His breath a warm, ragged vibration that made Kevin's knees feel like they were made of water. In the dark, with only the flickering street lamp outside the window for light, the world felt small and safe again. There were no cameras, no whispers, no social hierarchies to maintain. Mike's hands were everywhere, memorizing the sharp lines of Kevin's ribs and the softness of his skin. A masterpiece of grit and grace that no stadium light could ever capture. He leaned in, his forehead resting against Kevin's, his eyes dark with a hunger that was finally completely free. He told Kevin that he was done being the golden boy, that he'd rather spend every night in this small, quiet apartment than another minute in a hall full of ghosts. Kevin reached up, his fingers tracing the line of Mike's jaw, his touch steady and sure. He told Mike that he would spend his whole life cleaning up after people who didn't see him, but that being seen by Mike was the only thing that made him feel like he was finally home. The storm continued to howl outside, the wind shaking the window panes, but inside, the rhythm was slow and deep. They moved together with a familiarity that had been built in library basements and rainy locker rooms. A connection that didn't need a scoreboard to prove its worth. The hierarchy of the world had been demolished, leaving only the two of them in the quiet, beautiful center of the wreckage. As the rain finally began to tap out a softer rhythm against the glass, Mike pulled the blanket over them both, his arm anchored across Kevin's chest. He told Kevin that tomorrow was a new day, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what the headlines would say. Tuesday morning brought a sky that was painfully clear, the kind of sharp, unforgiving blue that made every shadow on the university turf look like a jagged blade. Kevin stood by the equipment shed, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a standard-issue gray hoodie. He wasn't there to mop the floors or scrub the benches. He was there because Mike had refused to step onto the pitch unless Kevin was the one timing his sprints. It was a silent, public declaration that the old rules had been burned to the ground. The air on the field was thick with a different kind of tension today. It wasn't the mockery of the high school gym. It was the cold, professional resentment of a team that had realized their captain was no longer playing their game. Xander was at the center of a small huddle, his eyes tracking Kevin with a predatory, silent heat. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He just watched, his jaw tight enough to snap. Mike emerged from the locker room, his cleats clicking against the concrete with a rhythmic, steady thud. He didn't look at the huddle. He didn't look at the coaches gathered near the water coolers. He walked straight to the sideline, stopping inches from Kevin. The sweat was already starting to bead on his forehead from the warm-up, his skin glowing in the morning light like polished bronze. He didn't say a word, just reached out and adjusted the stopwatch hanging around Kevin's neck, his fingers lingering against Kevin's chest for a second longer than necessary. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a match dropped in a room full of gasoline. The whistle blew, and the practice was brutal. The coach was pushing them harder than usual, his voice a raspy bark that echoed off the empty bleachers. He was testing Mike, trying to see if the distraction had dulled his edge. Every drill was a collision, every sprint a desperate scramble for air. Xander stayed on Mike's hip, his shoulder checking him a little too hard during the man-to-man defense, his elbows swinging with a reckless, jagged energy. During the break, the team gathered near the benches. The silence was suffocating. The only sound, the heavy, ragged breathing of the athletes and the dripping of the water cooler. Xander stepped forward, his jersey soaked in sweat, his eyes fixed on the stopwatch in Kevin's hand. He asked, his voice a low, venomous drawl, if the university was paying for a personal assistant now, or if Mike was just too soft to keep his own time. Mike didn't even look up from his water bottle. He told Xander that if he spent as much time practicing his footwork as he did worrying about other people's business, he might actually score a goal this season. The huddle went dead quiet. Xander's face went a dark, dangerous red. He started to step toward Mike, his fists clenched at his side, but the coach's whistle cut through the air like a knife. He told them to get back on the line, that they had a scrimmage to finish and not enough heart to waste on a locker room spat. The final 30 minutes of the practice were a masterclass in controlled fury. Mike played with a cold, lethal precision that silenced the whispers on the sideline. He moved like he was part of the wind, his body a blur of grit and grace that the rest of the team couldn't touch. Every time he scored, he didn't celebrate. He just looked back at the sideline, his gaze locking onto Kevin's for a split second before turning back to the game. When the final whistle blew, the team collapsed onto the grass, exhausted and broken. Mike didn't join them. He walked over to Kevin, his chest heaving, his skin radiating a heat that Kevin could feel from a foot away. He grabbed a towel from Kevin's hand, his fingers brushing against Kevin's palm in a way that made the air in the stadium feel suddenly dangerously thin. He whispered, his voice a low, raspy vibration, that he needed a shower and that he didn't want to go back to the locker room alone. Kevin looked at the coaches, then at the team still staring from the center of the field. He felt the weight of 1,000 eyes, the judgment of a world that still saw him as a smudge on the varsity gold. But then, he looked at Mike, at the raw, honest hunger in his eyes, and he realized that the invisibility was never coming back. He nodded, his hand finding the small of Mike's back as they started the long walk toward the athletic wing. The silence behind them was heavy, but it didn't matter. They were walking into the steam together, leaving the hierarchy of the world on the grass behind them. The athletic wing was silent. The only sound the distant hum of the ventilation system and the rhythmic squeak of Mike's cleats against the wet tile. Most of the team had already cleared out, heading for the student union or the training tables, leaving the air heavy with the lingering scent of grass and wintergreen. Mike didn't head for the main row of communal nozzles. He led Kevin toward the back, past the equipment cages to a heavy steel door marked for staff and coaches only. Inside, the room was smaller, more private, the walls lined with smooth white tile that seemed to glow under the dim overhead lights. Mike didn't wait to turn on the water. He pulled Kevin into the center of the space, his hands still grimy from the pitch, his chest heaving with the remnants of the scrimmage. He whispered that he was tired of the eyes, tired of the whispers, and tired of the distance they had to keep whenever the sun was up. He reached for the valve, turning it until the pipes groaned and a thick, scalding spray began to fill the room with a wall of white steam. The heat was instantaneous, a humid, heavy fog that blurred the sharp edges of the locker room and turned the world into a soft, private sanctuary. Kevin felt the moisture clinging to his hoodie, the fabric becoming heavy and restrictive. He reached for the hem, but Mike's hands were already there, sliding under the cotton to find the heat of Kevin's skin. Mike's touch was different today. It wasn't the tentative, questioning reach of the library basement. It was a hungry, desperate claim, a release of all the pressure the university had been piling on his shoulders. The clothes hit the floor in a sodden pile. The gray hoodie and the varsity shorts discarded like the roles they played outside these walls. Mike stepped into the spray, the water slicking his hair back and streaming down the hard, defined planes of his back. He reached out, his hand hooking into the back of Kevin's neck to pull him into the heat. The water was a relentless, rhythmic drumming against the tile, a heartbeat that belonged only to them. Mike pressed Kevin back against the cool, wet wall, his body a furnace of adrenaline and raw, honest need. He whispered Kevin's name against the hollow of his throat, his voice a low, raspy vibration that was nearly drowned out by the roar of the shower. Kevin's hands found the muscles of Mike's shoulders, the grit of the field still under his fingernails. But he didn't care about the dirt. He cared about the way Mike was looking at him, like he was the only solid thing in a world that was constantly shifting. He pulled Mike closer, their skin sliding together in a chaotic, beautiful mess of heat and water. The kiss tasted of salt and iron, a primal, unfiltered connection that shattered the last of the social hierarchy. There was no captain here, no janitor, no scholarship at stake. There was only the steam, the rhythmic thud of the water, and the way Mike's hands gripped Kevin's waist as if he were trying to anchor himself to the earth. As the steam grew thicker, hiding the door and the world beyond it, Mike leaned in, his forehead resting against Kevin's. He told him that he didn't want to go back out there, that he'd rather stay in the mist forever if it meant they never had to let go. The steam began to thin as Mike reached out and killed the water, the sudden silence in the small room feeling heavier than the roar of the shower ever was. The only sound left was the steady, rhythmic drip from the chrome nozzle and the hitched, jagged breathing of two people who had just finished a battle of their own. Kevin leaned his head back against the cool tile, his skin glowing a dull pink from the heat, his glasses sitting fogged and useless on a nearby bench. Mike didn't move away. He stayed in Kevin's space, his wet forehead resting against Kevin's as he reached for a single, oversized towel. He didn't just hand it over. He started to dry Kevin off with a slow, almost reverent care, his movements devoid of the frantic energy of the scrimmage. He moved the heavy fabric over Kevin's shoulders and down his arms, his touch a silent, steady apology for every stare and every whisper they'd endured since the sun came up. The locker room was a cathedral of shadows, the dim overhead lights flickering just enough to catch the moisture on the walls. Mike stopped, his hands resting on Kevin's waist. His gaze dropping to the floor, he admitted, his voice a low, gravelly vibration, that the coach had pulled him aside after the team dinner. He said they were worried about his focus and about the image of the university's star player being tied to a guy who used to carry a mop. Kevin felt the familiar, cold sting of reality settling back into his bones, the invisible weight of the jumpsuit returning even though he was standing there, bare-skinned and clean. He started to pull back, his fingers searching for the edge of the towel, but Mike's grip tightened. Mike looked up, his eyes dark with a fierce, stubborn loyalty that made the air in the room feel suddenly, dangerously thin. He told Kevin that he'd told the coach to keep the image, because he was keeping the man. He said if they wanted a captain who lied about who he was, they could give the armband to Xander and see how fast the season fell apart. Kevin reached up, his hand finding the damp, golden hair at the nape of Mike's neck. He told Mike that he didn't want to be the reason Mike lost everything, that he'd spent his whole life being a ghost and he knew how to disappear if it meant Mike could stay the king. Mike let out a short, dry laugh that didn't have any humor in it. He stepped closer, pinning Kevin between his body and the lockers, his heart thudding a hard, relentless rhythm against Kevin's chest. He told Kevin that he'd been a ghost long before they met, just a hollow shell in a varsity jersey, and that Kevin was the only thing that had ever made him feel like he was actually breathing. The silence stretched, heavy and unsaid, and they stood in the quiet of the coach's wing. Outside, the campus was moving on, the students heading to dinner, and the scouts filing their reports. But inside the mist-stained room, the hierarchy was dead. Mike leaned in, his mouth finding Kevin's in a kiss that wasn't about hunger or heat, but about a slow, permanent promise. He whispered that they were going to the next game together, and they were walking through the front gates, not the back. The championship stadium was a coliseum of blinding white light. the hum of 40,000 fans vibrating through the concrete and into the soles of Kevin's shoes. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, cheap beer, and the electric ozone of a high-stakes night. Kevin stood at the player's entrance, his fingers curled tightly around the strap of his gear bag. He wasn't wearing the jumpsuit, and he wasn't hiding in the shadows of the equipment shed. He was wearing Mike's spare varsity jacket, the heavy wool smelling of home and laundry detergent. The team bus had pulled up to the main gate 10 minutes ago, and the silence that had followed them from the campus was now a physical weight. Xander and the rest of the starters had filed out first, their faces masks of cold, professional indifference. They didn't look at Kevin, and they didn't look at Mike. It was a silent mutiny, a team divided by a truth they couldn't scrub away. Mike stepped off the bus last, his cleats clicking against the asphalt with a slow, rhythmic thud. He didn't look at the cameras lining the red carpet or the scouts whispering into their headsets. He walked straight to Kevin, his jaw set in a hard, dangerous line. He didn't say a word, just reached out and locked his fingers with Kevin's. Their joined hands a silent, defiant signal to the entire stadium. They walked through the tunnel together, the roar of the crowd growing louder with every step until it was a physical roar that threatened to swallow them whole. The cameras followed them, the flashes reflecting off Kevin's glasses, but he didn't look down. He kept his head up, his gaze fixed on the bright, green expanse of the pitch waiting for them. At the edge of the grass, the athletic director was waiting, his face a dark, stormy red. He started to step forward, his mouth opening to say something about the spectacle and the reputation of the university. But Mike didn't give him the chance. He just squeezed Kevin's hand one last time, a silent, grounding pulse, and stepped onto the field. The game was a brutal, jagged struggle. The opposing team knew about the tension in the locker room, and they exploited it, their defenders targeting Mike with a relentless physical aggression. Xander was playing a ghost game, refusing to pass, refusing to cover, leaving Mike to carry the weight of the entire season on his own. By the end of the first half, the score was 0-1. Mike walked toward the sideline, his jersey soaked in sweat and dirt, his breathing a shallow, ragged rasp. He sat on the bench, his head in his hands, the pressure of the scouts and the scholarship finally starting to show in the slump of his shoulders. Kevin didn't wait for the trainers. He stepped over the low stone wall, the security guards starting to move toward him before Mike raised a hand to stop him. Kevin sat down on the bench, his shoulder brushing against Mike's, the heat of the game radiating off the athlete in waves. He didn't offer a pep talk, and he didn't talk about the score. He just reached into his bag and pulled out a worn-out physics manual, the one they'd used in the library basement. He told Mike, his voice a low, steady vibration, that the math hadn't changed. He said that gravity and force didn't care about the whispers or the suit or the scholarship. He told Mike to stop playing for the scouts and start playing for the kid who used to stay late in the gym just to hear the sound of the ball hitting the net. Mike looked up, his eyes clearing for the first time since they'd left the campus. He reached out and touched the corner of the manual, his fingers tracing the creased edges of the cover. He let out a short, dry laugh, his hand finding Kevin's under the bench. He whispered that he'd forgotten how to calculate the trajectory when the noise got too loud. The second half was a massacre. Mike played with a cold, lethal precision that made the crowd go dead quiet. He didn't wait for Xander's passes. He intercepted them. He moved through the defense like he was part of the wind, his body a blur of grit and grace that the other team couldn't touch. He scored once, then twice, the stadium erupting into a frenzy that shook the foundations of the bleachers. With 10 seconds left on the clock, the score was tied. Mike had the ball at the corner, the defenders closing in. He saw the opening, saw the scouts leaning forward in their seats. But he didn't look at the goal. He looked at the sideline, at The guy in the varsity jacket who was standing near the water cooler. Mike took the shot. The ball arched through the night air, a perfect silver curve that hit the back of the net with a final, beautiful snap. The buzzer sounded, and the stadium went nuclear. Mike didn't join the huddle. He didn't look for the trophy. He ran straight for the sideline, straight for the invisible man who had become his only solid ground. He grabbed Kevin by the front of the jacket and pulled him into a kiss that silenced the front 3 rows of the VIP section. It was the end of the season, and the beginning of everything else. The championship trophy was a cold piece of metal sitting forgotten on the back seat of the silver sedan, but the heat inside the car was enough to fog the windows before they even cleared the stadium parking lot. Mike didn't drive back to the dorms or the team after party. He drove straight to the small, quiet apartment, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight the leather groaned. He didn't say a word, but his breathing was a jagged, heavy rhythm that filled the small space, a silent countdown to the moment the doors finally closed behind them. The second the deadbolt clicked, the world outside ceased to exist. Mike didn't wait to turn on the lights. He pushed Kevin back against the door, the heavy varsity jacket hitting the floor with a muffled thud. The air in the room was cool, but Mike was a furnace, his skin still radiating the adrenaline and the grit of the 90-minute struggle on the pitch. He leaned in, his mouth finding Kevin's in a kiss that was primal, unfiltered, and tasted of salt and a final, beautiful victory. His hands were everywhere, memorizing the sharp lines of Kevin's ribs and the softness of his waist, stripping away the layers of the student and the athlete until there was nothing left but the raw, honest need they'd been building since the library basement. Mike's fingers hooked into the waistband of Kevin's jeans, his movements frantic but certain, pulling him into the heat of the bedroom where the only light was the silver glow of the moon slicing through the blinds. They tumbled onto the bed, a chaotic, beautiful mess of limbs and breath. Mike hovered over him, his muscles rippling under the moonlight, a masterpiece of force and grace that no stadium camera could ever capture. He whispered Kevin's name, his voice a low, raspy vibration that settled deep in Kevin's chest. He told him that he didn't want the cheers. He didn't want the scouts. He just wanted this. The sheets were cool against Kevin's back, but Mike's body was a searing weight, pinning him to the mattress. Every touch was a claim, every slide of skin against skin, a demolition of the social hierarchy that had tried to keep them apart. Kevin's hands found the damp, golden hair at the nape of Mike's neck, pulling him down, needing to feel the reality of the man who had traded a crown for a connection. The rhythm was slow, deep, and rhythmic, like the steady beat of a drum in the middle of a storm. There was no captain here, no janitor, no scholarship at stake. There was only the sound of their hitched breathing and the way Mike's fingers locked with Kevin's. Their palms pressed together as if they were trying to fuse into a single, solid thing. Mike leaned down, his forehead resting against Kevin's, his eyes dark with a hunger that was finally, completely free. In the quiet of the apartment, with the trophy sitting in the dark and the world finally silent, the gravity was finally pulling them home. Mike whispered that he wasn't going back, that he was staying right here, in the light that Kevin had brought into his life. The morning sun was cutting through the kitchen window in sharp, unforgiving slats of gold, turning the steam from the coffee into a swirling, white mist. Mike was standing at the stove, his back a broad expanse of tanned skin and fading grass stains from the night before. He was wearing nothing but a pair of low-slung gray sweats, his muscles rippling with every movement of the spatula. Kevin sat at the small wooden table, his physics manual open, but his eyes weren't on the equations. They were tracking the way the light caught the ridge of Mike's spine. The championship was over. The trophy was sitting on the counter next to a half-empty box of cereal, and the world was finally, blessedly quiet. Mike turned around, the smell of scorching butter and coffee filling the small space. He didn't say a word, just leaned against the counter and watched Kevin through the steam. The air in the kitchen was heavy, thick with the lingering adrenaline of the victory and the raw, honest heat they'd brought home from the stadium. Mike walked over, his bare feet silent on the linoleum, and closed the textbook with a slow, deliberate click. He told Kevin, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, that the math could wait. Mike reached out, his hands sliding under the hem of Kevin's oversized t-shirt to find the heat of his waist. He pulled Kevin to his feet, the chair screeching against the floor, and hoisted him onto the edge of the laminate counter. The cold surface was a sharp contrast to the furnace-like heat of Mike's chest as he stepped between Kevin's knees, pinning him against the cupboards. The breakfast was forgotten, the coffee cooling in the pot. Mike's mouth found Kevin's, the kiss tasting of salt and caffeine, a primal, hungry claim that made the kitchen feel like it was boiling. His hands were everywhere, memorizing the sharp lines of Kevin's ribs, pulling him closer until there was no air left between them. Kevin's fingers found the waistband of the gray sweats, his touch frantic but certain, needing to feel the reality of the man who had traded his reputation for this moment. The sunlight was blinding, reflecting off the chrome of the toaster and the glass of the window, blurring the world into a haze of gold and heat. The rhythm was slow, deep, and rhythmic, matching the steady pulse of the city waking up outside. There was no captain here, no janitor, no scholarship at stake. There was only the sound of their hitched breathing and the way Mike's fingers locked with Kevin's on the edge of the counter, their knuckles turning white. Mike leaned in, his forehead resting against Kevin's, his eyes dark with a hunger that was finally, completely free. In the quiet of the morning, with the gold medal sitting in the dark and the world finally silent, the gravity was finally pulling them home. Mike whispered that he wasn't going back to the locker room, that he was staying right here, in the light that Kevin had brought into his life. The remnants of breakfast were forgotten, the coffee cooling in its pot as the morning light shifted, casting long golden bars across the linoleum floor. Mike didn't let him up from the counter. Instead, he stepped closer, his body a solid, immovable wall of heat that pinned Kevin against the cabinets. The steady hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the small kitchen until Mike's hand slid up the back of Kevin's neck, his fingers tangling in the messy hair that had yet to be brushed. Mike's mouth found the sensitive line of Kevin's throat, his stubble grazing the skin with a rough, grounding friction. He whispered that he didn't want the awards gala, didn't want the team photos, and didn't want the quiet of the library ever again. He just wanted this. The raw, honest hunger in his voice was a low vibration that Kevin felt in his marrow. Kevin's legs wrapped around Mike's waist, pulling him flush against his chest, the friction of the denim against Mike's bare skin creating a static charge that seemed to ionize the air. The kitchen, once a place of mundane routines and whispered physics equations, was transformed into a private sanctuary, where the only hierarchy that mattered was the one written in their tangled limbs. Mike's hands gripped the edge of the laminate counter, his knuckles turning white as he found a rhythm that was primal and perfectly synchronized. Every breath was a shared secret, every slide of skin against skin a defiant erasure of the months they'd spent in the shadows. The sunlight was blinding now, reflecting off the chrome toaster and the silver championship trophy, blurring the world into a haze of gold and heat. In the quiet of the apartment, as the city woke up outside their window, there was no captain and no janitor. There was only the sound of their hitched breathing and the way Mike's forehead rested against Kevin's, his eyes dark with a fierce, protective loyalty. He told Kevin that he was never letting the light go out again. The apartment was thick with a heavy golden silence as the adrenaline finally ebbed, leaving only the sound of their shared, synchronized breathing. Mike didn't pull away. He stayed anchored between Kevin's knees, his forehead resting against Kevin's as the sweat cooled on their skin in the morning draft. He reached out, his large hand covering Kevin's on the laminate surface, his thumb tracing the ridge of Kevin's knuckles with a slow, possessive tenderness. Mike let out a long, shaky exhale, a small laugh huffing against Kevin's collarbone. He whispered that he'd never realized how much noise was in his head until it finally went quiet. He looked at the discarded physics manual on the floor and then back at the guy who had seen through the varsity jacket since day one. He told Kevin that he was done with the Golden Boy Act, that if the university wanted a trophy, they could have the one on the counter, but he was keeping the life they were building here. Kevin reached up, his fingers sliding Mike's damp hair back from his forehead. He felt the solid weight of the athlete against him, the reality of the man who had traded his status for a seat at a wobbly kitchen table. He told Mike that he'd spent his whole life trying to be a ghost, but standing here in the light, he'd never felt more solid. They stayed like that for a long time, the forgotten coffee cold in the pot and the city humming outside their window. The social hierarchy of the campus, the bitter stares of Xander, and the pressure of the scouts felt like a distant, fading radio signal. Mike finally straightened up, but he didn't let go of Kevin's hand. He steered him toward the small sofa by the window, pulling the heavy wool blanket over both of them. He told Kevin that they had exactly 3 hours before they had to face the world at the awards gala. And he intended to spend every second of it right here, where the rules didn't apply. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long amber shadows across the living room as the 3-hour countdown to the gala ticked away. Mike didn't move from the sofa, his heavy arm draped over Kevin's shoulders, pulling him into the crook of his neck. The silence was thick, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the library basement. It was light, filled only with the steady hum of the city and the rhythmic thrum of Mike's heart under Kevin's ear. Mike reached for the velvet-lined box on the coffee table, the championship medal. He didn't look at it with the hunger he'd had at the start of the season. He turned the gold over in his hand, the medal catching the dying light, and then he draped the ribbon around Kevin's neck. He whispered that the only reason he'd run those extra miles, the only reason he'd pushed through the mutiny on the field, was because he knew who was waiting for him at the finish line. Kevin looked down at the gold resting against his chest, a strange, heavy weight that felt like an anchor. He told Mike that he'd spent years cleaning up after celebrations he wasn't invited to, and now he was the one wearing the prize. But the peace was broken by the sharp, persistent buzz of Mike's phone on the glass table. It was a flurry of notifications. The university's official social media had posted a teaser for the gala, and the comments were a battlefield. Xander's name kept popping up, along with tradition and scandal. The world was already trying to claw its way back into their sanctuary before they'd even stepped out the door. Mike didn't even unlock the screen. He flipped the phone face down, the glass clicking against the table. He looked at Kevin, his eyes dark with a fierce, unwavering resolve. He told him that tonight wasn't about the medal or the scholarship anymore. It was about showing them that the Golden Boy wasn't a prize they owned. He was a person they couldn't control. He stood up, pulling Kevin with him, his hands sliding down to lock their fingers together. He said it was time to put the charcoal suit back on. The gala was a sea of black ties and champagne flutes, the air vibrating with the polite, hollow chatter of the university's elite. When the double doors of the grand ballroom swung open, the sound didn't just fade, it died. Every head turned, every conversation snapped mid-sentence. Mike didn't lead the way. He walked exactly half a step beside Kevin, their shoulders brushing with every stride. Kevin could feel the heat of the camera flashes against the charcoal fabric of his suit, but he didn't blink. He wasn't looking at the board of directors or the scouts whispering behind their hands. He was looking at the way the light caught the steady, unyielding set of Mike's jaw. They reached the center of the room, where the athletic director stood like a stone monument to tradition. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a smile. He looked at their joined hands, his face a mask of cold, institutional disapproval. He started to say something about the expectations of a captain, his voice a low, warning rumble. Mike didn't let him finish. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the gold championship medal, the one he'd draped over Kevin earlier that afternoon. He didn't hand it to the director. He set it down on the velvet-covered podium next to the microphone, the metal clicking against the wood with a final echoing thud. He told the room, his voice amplified by the silence, that if they wanted the medal, they could have it. But if they wanted the man who won it, they had to accept the man who helped him find the strength to play. Xander was standing near the bar, his drink frozen halfway to his mouth, his face a pale, empty white. He'd spent his whole life believing that power was about who you could push down. But watching Mike stand there, he finally saw what real power looked like. It was the ability to walk away from a throne for a heart. Mike turned back to Kevin, his eyes softening as he reached out to adjust Kevin's tie. He whispered that the air in here was still too thin, and he had a much better idea of how to spend the rest of the night. They walked back out through the same doors, leaving the gala, the trophies, and the expectations behind them. The silver sedan was waiting in the rain, and as they pulled out of the lot, Kevin reached over and turned up the radio. The world was still loud, and the future was still a fight. But for the first time, the music belonged to them. The morning after the gala felt different. The sun was hitting the red brick of the university quad with a clarity that usually only comes after a massive storm. Kevin adjusted the strap of his messenger bag, his fingers brushing against the wool of the varsity jacket Mike had draped over his shoulders before they left the apartment. For years, the quad had been a place of transit, a stretch of pavement to be scrubbed or crossed as quickly as possible. But today, the rhythm had changed. Mike was walking beside him, his stride loose and easy, his hand unashamedly locked with Kevin's. They weren't ducking into the shadows of the library or meeting in the corner of a darkened gym. They were walking straight down the center of the main walk, past the fountain where the freshmen gathered and the stone benches where the scouts usually sat with their clipboards. The whispers followed them, of course. A group of cheerleaders stopped their mid-air stunt to stare. A few members of the swim team slowed their jog, nudging each other as the golden boy walked by with the guy who used to hold the keys to their lockers. But then, something shifted. As they neared the engineering wing, a junior linebacker, a guy who usually followed Xander's lead, nodded at Mike. It wasn't a mock or a sneer. It was a short, sharp acknowledgement. Then a girl from Kevin's advanced calculus seminar stepped out of the crowd, giving them a small, genuine smile before heading toward the lab. The scandal hadn't broken them. It had just made the air around them feel a lot more honest. They reached the fork in the path where Mike had to head to the training facility, and Kevin had to head to his structural theory lecture. Mike didn't just give a quick wave. He stopped, pulling Kevin into his space, right in front of the massive bronze statue of the university founder. He reached up, his thumb grazing Kevin's cheek, his eyes bright with a fierce, quiet triumph. He whispered that he'd see him at the campus cafe at noon, not in the back booth, but right by the window. Kevin watched him walk away, the number 1 on Mike's back receding into the crowd of students. He turned toward the heavy oak doors of the lecture hall, his chin up. He walked into the room, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look for the seat in the back row. He walked right to the front, sat down, and opened his notebook. The professor started the lecture, the chalk scratching against the board. But Kevin's mind was on the window seat at noon. The invisibility was gone for good, and in its place was a life that finally felt like it belonged to him. The campus cafe was a glass-walled fishbowl of activity, smelling of roasted beans and the frantic energy of midterms. When Kevin walked in at noon, the usual lull in conversation didn't happen. Instead, it was replaced by a low, steady hum of recognition. He didn't hover at the entrance, or look for a corner to disappear into. He walked straight to the window booth, where Mike was already waiting, 2 steaming cups of coffee between them. Mike looked up, his face breaking into a grin that wasn't for the cameras or the scouts. It was the same lopsided, private smile he'd given Kevin in the basement of the high school library, only now the whole world could see it. He reached across the table, his hand covering Kevin's on the polished wood, his thumb tracing the familiar line of Kevin's knuckles. They sat there for an hour, talking about structural load-bearing points and the upcoming away game, their voices mixing with the clink of ceramic and the chatter of other students. People walked by, some stared, some whispered, and a few even waved, but the invisible wall that had kept them in separate worlds had finally crumbled. As they stood up to leave, Mike pulled Kevin close for a brief, firm squeeze of his shoulder, a silent promise that the golden boy and the ghost were officially a thing of the past. They walked out of the cafe and back into the bright, sharp light of the quad, their shadows stretching out long and joined behind them. The future was still a long road of labs, practices, and the occasional glare from Xander. But as they reached the center of the campus, Kevin realized he didn't need to be invisible to be safe. He just needed to be seen by the right person. That concludes the story of Kevin and Mike.